Welcome back to the Testing 1, 2, 3 podcast. As always, I'm Brett, joined by Lester. Lester, we're talking about the Bible today.
The Bible, my favorite.
About the Word of God. We're going to get into a little bit more a logical stance and why we can trust the Bible. Maybe a little scriptural authenticity, you might say.
A little bit.
I want to bring this up before we jump all the way in. Have you ever had an interaction where someone, says like, hey, like, yeah, that's great, you believe the Bible, but there's no way those words could be true?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
100% I've had that kind of interaction before. I mean, I've even had those kinds of interactions with people who profess to be Christians, that they say, oh, yeah, well, the Bible is like an allegory, or like it was written at a much later date, and it's just a collection of nice stories that we're supposed to learn from.
Like an allegory, that's an interesting one to me. I don't think I've ever heard that. The whole Bible is
The
an
whole
allegory?
thing. Yeah, the whole thing.
Tough to see how it all fits.
So their thinking was that, like, at some point a long time ago, there was some truth, but there were, like, the story got conflated and inflated so much that, like, there isn't like a...
I see. So there was some truth, like, oh, Jesus was a great guy, but it got inflated to him being the savior.
Yeah,
Which,
absolutely.
I mean, that's a very easy point to argue back to.
Yeah.
But I see what you're saying. So, like, he didn't actually feed 5,000. He fed 50, but, like, everyone told the story. Next thing you know, like, when you tell your buddies a story, you're like, yeah, and there was, like, 20 people there. By the time you tell it a year later, there was 2,000 people there. It's crazy, man. Like,
yeah.
People just naturally do that. So that's kind of their viewpoint.
Yeah, it's that fish that you caught last summer just keeps growing.
Yeah. It's like, dude, biggest fish I caught, it was 47 feet.
Oh, and, for sure. Oh, definitely. Huge.
All right, so why don't we jump in? We're going to kind of base this all off an original statement from a biblical side, and then we're just kind of pick it apart. We'll tell some stories. We'll just show. We're going to try to prove to the best that we can trust the Bible, and me and Lester both believe that. I mean, that's not, and we're going to show you maybe from a more logical side, not like an emotional response or a spiritual response, but just like, hey, here's how we know we can trust the Bible.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think we often think through this very much as just Christians. We kind of take the Bible kind of for granted, our trust in the Bible for granted. We don't often think like, why should I be able to trust my Bible? And some of the arguments that I've heard for, like, when push comes to shove, when you're asked, like, why do you trust the Bible? Well, maybe because my parents told me, or maybe because, like, this is worked for me. I tried it and it worked for me. And I'm not saying that your parents are wrong, or that if you try the Bible, it won't work, because it will. But perhaps those aren't the best arguments. First of all, I think when it comes to knowing and testing if something is true, I think it's always best to discover for yourself. Ask questions. Just because Brett says, or Lester says, or mom says, or dad says something is true doesn't make it true. Check it out. Test. Ask questions. So we shouldn't be relying on somebody else to tell us, yeah, that's definitely true. We should always ask questions.
Yeah, I think we want to look at this in light of evangelism too. Like,
Yeah.
when we talk about a lot of things in this podcast, we're talking about, like, how do we explain this to the rest of the world?
Yeah.
A lot of it is discipleship, like, how do we explain this within our own group and how can I grow from this? But some of it is like, how do I explain this to the rest of the world? And my dad told me, or I trust it, isn't a great answer. And to be honest, if someone was trying to convert you to their religion, if they were like a Buddhist,
A Buddha.
I mean, if they were Buddha, maybe they were Buddhist, or they were, I don't know, a Muslim or something like that. If they just said, oh, because I was told, you'd be like, I'm never going to listen. Because you were told, I was told something else. Like, that doesn't prove anything. So that's why I want to keep this in the light of, we're trying to do this so we can look at this through evangelism eyes, through the eyes of evangelism, and see, like, hey, we as Christians can't just go around saying, we're right, just trust us. Yeah. Sometimes we actually have to show, like, hey, we prove it. And it's a good exercise for us individually to know, like, hey, I can trust this. I don't have to be, like, on unsteady ground.
Exactly.
So why don't you jump in?
The other thing.
Okay.
Real quick. The experiential thing also. Like, you hear this a lot, like, where somebody's trying to convince somebody else that the Bible is good and true.
Yeah.
And they'll say, well, like, I did this, I tried it, I read it, and I applied it to my life, and it worked. And you're absolutely right. If you do this and apply it to your life, it will 100% work. But that, again, is not perhaps the best way to demonstrate to somebody that the Bible is a reliable document. Because
Well, yeah, Muslims would say that about the Quran.
Exactly.
That statement can be made about a random book.
Exactly. And I mean, how many times have you read like an Amazon review for a product and you purchased it based on that person saying like, oh yeah, this product worked for me. It was good. And you got it and it was junk. Like that product was terrible.
I mean, every infomercial of all time.
Every infomercial ever.
Every weight loss or diet pill.
Yeah. Billy Mays here for... What was it? OxyClean.
Yeah. Or my favorite guy is the
slap
flex
chop?
tape.
Oh,
No,
flex tape
guy.
Flex tape.
Flex tape
Yeah,
guy's a
flex
legend.
tape, yeah.
We cut the whole bottom of the boat up, wrapped it in flex tape, or float. And it's like, why did you need to cut the bottom of the boat out?
Flex tape.
Flex tape. Flex tape guy's awesome. That he is. And hey, that stuff, actually, I'm not saying it works, but it kind of works.
Brett tried it and it works.
It did. I did try. I used it when I used to work for pools. But
Anyway.
Let's dive into the statement.
Yes.
And then we'll bounce off from there.
Yeah, okay. So in order to really know that the Bible is true, the statement you should use is, the Bible is a reliable collection of historical documents written by eyewitnesses during the lifetime of other eyewitnesses who report supernatural events that fulfill specific prophecies and claim that the writings are divine rather than human in origin. If you can recite that for me and recite it perfectly, then I know that every time that somebody asks you, how do I know the Bible is true, you're going to give them this answer and you're going to be just fine.
Yeah, so
Perfect.
I have heard this statement about 5 or 6 times this morning, and I couldn't even get past the 5th word if I had it off memory. But I'm going to jump in. We start this statement with, the Bible is a reliable collection of historical documents. Let's just take that part, right?
Yeah. So part 1, the Bible is a reliable collection. So how do we know that the Bible is reliable? This goes back to how you prove something to be true. And most often in culture and society today, you'll hear these arguments like, "Oh, I'm a person of science." Like,
I'm a person of science.
I only trust things that are measurable, observable, repeatable, like the scientific method, right? But the thing about the scientific method is that it cannot prove something that happened in the past because you can't repeat that thing exactly the same way. What I mean by this is, like, let's take the court of law, and they're trying to prove that somebody is a murderer. They don't use the scientific method because he'd have to repeat the murder. What do you want him to?
So
right?
we brought someone in, just show us how you did it. Do it the same way, and we'll be able to prove that.
See, he did it the same way. Right? Instead, another way to understand and determine truth is using the evidentiary method. So a method that relies on evidence. So this requires that the sources you're using are reliable, that you can corroborate those sources, and finally, that the internal and external reliability of that source that you're talking about, the evidence that you're talking about, is high. So let's break that down. What does that all mean? Reliability of sources. First of all, if we look at ancient documents as a whole, nobody, and I mean nobody, has originals.
Yeah, no, it doesn't exist in any ancient document in the world.
I mean, we were just talking about this before the podcast, before the episode started. I don't think anybody has like an original copy of, say, like the Hobbit.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe they do. I could be wrong here. But I know for sure that like people don't have original copies of many of Shakespeare's work. There isn't like that original, this is the paper that Shakespeare wrote it down on.
Yeah.
You have copies of those things. So that's first of all. So ancient copies of things are called manuscripts. And similar documents are documents like Aristotle's Poetics. So these are documents that are widely accepted in academic circles, where if you study them in a university, they'll say, yep, that's a legit document. That's actually what Aristotle wrote. And a document like that, there are less than 12 ancient manuscripts, and all of those ancient manuscripts are over 1,000 years old or younger than the original. So they were written 1,000 years later than Aristotle first wrote his. The best example of an ancient document that we have is Homer's Iliad. And there are a few hundred ancient manuscripts of Homer's Iliad, but those were written 2,100 years after the original. Now compare that to the Bible. There are over 6,000, not like 2,100, not a few hundred, 6,000 ancient manuscripts or portions of manuscripts, and the earliest documents are 110 AD, 120 AD for the New Testament alone. So that's just the New Testament, over 6,000 ancient manuscripts. And they are like 100 years after the original was written.
Yeah, between 170 years and 450 is kind of where we get our guide map there.
Yeah.
They range. I mean, there's so many documents. You can see why they put a scale. Like, not every document was written at the same time. Like, let's write all 6,000 and leave them here. But it does give a certainty to what was written, because, I mean, if we're going to trust the Iliad to be a story, and no one's taking the Iliad as like this has happened, because there's a lot of mythological characters in the Iliad, but they're saying, oh, this is what Homer wrote.
Yeah,
like, this
he
is what he
that.
wrote,
Yeah.
and then we know it. But we're stretching 1,000 years. Like, come on, like, that's 1,000 years. That's hard for us to imagine. Like, just imagining 1,000 years is tough. And I'm not even saying I disbelieve it. That could be what Homer wrote. I mean, there's a really good lineage of storytelling in ancient times that we just don't experience nowadays, where like a person in a tribe would be tasked with knowing all the stories of that tribe, right? And they would share them to the next person, and that was like their life. So I would say the Iliad is probably pretty close to what Homer wrote. But if you're going to say that, then you have to admit, then the Bible is probably almost spot on. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah. And so another point to its reliability, and something that you'll hear often that people will criticize the Bible for on its accuracy, are things like, the Bible is like broken telephone. This is the conversation we had earlier, where like they kept telling these stories and they got more fantastical over time. Eventually, this bird becomes like a dragon, or like, a little cat becomes a lion.
Yeah, I mean, it becomes so much bigger. The fish gets to 47 feet.
Jesus may have helped a guy cross a street, and then suddenly, he's making the lame walk. He's making the blind to see. It's incredible. But the thing is, you don't see that with these. There's no ballooning of the story, if you will, with these ancient manuscripts. Anytime we go to make a translation of the Bible, like a new translation of the Bible, like the ESV, the NIV, NLT, whatever.
The Message?
Sure. Well, not the Message. Let's exclude the Message.
Disavowing the Message. You heard it
the
live.
Message is not a direct translation.
That's true. It's true.
Yeah. So anytime we make one of these types of translations, where it's like the ESV, NIV, those kinds of translations, they go straight back to the ancient Hebrew. They aren't translating from the Latin Vulgate. They aren't translating from another like King James version or something like that, where they're like just trying to make the language easier to read. No, they're going all the way back to the original. So it's not a game of broken telephone.
So can we admit? Maybe we can say we can trust the reliability of the documents. We've made that statement now.
Absolutely. Yeah. We can definitely trust the reliability of the documents. So much so that, the Bible is so reliable that if you were to totally eliminate every single copy of the Bible, the New Testament, you could actually reconstruct the whole entire New Testament with just commentaries on it, like where people have referred to the Bible here or referred to a verse here or there. You could reconstruct the whole Bible from just commentaries. It is one of the most heavily read, commentated on, and historically well-preserved documents of all time. In fact, it is the most. It's not one of. It is actually the most historically well-preserved document of all time. So you know for a fact that the Bible is reliable.
So we've covered reliable and we've covered historical. I do want you to touch just very quickly on the collection. Not in sense of, hey, we've talked a ton about like where we get all these manuscripts from. But a common concern I've heard is well, the Bible's a bunch of different books written by a bunch of different people. I'm leading you into the next one if you can't notice this by now. And that one guy might be right, but the next guy might be lying, right? Like two people tell the same story, which let's take the four Gospels, for example. They tell a lot of the same stories. And, some people like to tell stories like by the facts. Other people like to exaggerate, other people like to just tell a good story. And maybe that's where we're getting a little mixed up. Like they just like to tell a good story and they weren't around. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. That's my tease to really see what happened. What would our response be back to that, Lester?
Yeah, so that's the thing about the evidentiary method is that the document needs to have internal reliability. And that's one of the things that the Bible, again, is super strong on. Yes, you might have some stylistic differences between books, right? So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they're all recordings of Jesus' life. And for sure, you can see stylistic differences between Mark and Matthew and Luke, the way that they write. But the important facts and the important details are never contradictory. They're not going to be contradictory. In fact, you can look over the whole Bible and find that it is internally reliable. So some examples of that include, like in the Old Testament, which is in Isaiah 53, 700 years before Jesus comes, they accurately prophesy that Jesus is coming. And this is kind of a tease to what we're going to be talking about in the future, but or at a later time, not the future, but at a later time in this podcast, a little bit later. But the other thing that's super impressive about the Bible and its internal reliability is that it was written in 3 different languages with over 40 authors in 3 continents over 1,500 years, and they all attest to the truth of the same story. And I think that actually is something that is a strength of the Bible and not a weakness. That, in fact, over 40 authors attest to the same truth without all having read everybody else's documents. They all attest to the same truth. Now, have they read some of the other people's documents? Yes, of course they have. But they haven't read all of the other people's documents, yet all of their writings remain consistent and true.
Okay, so they're internally reliable, the book. Now let's get to the writers themselves. We're mostly going to be focusing on the New Testament. These writers... how do we know they weren't just, writing about a story that they weren't around for, or, just trying to capture all the stories? Like a lot of writers go around capturing stories of what happened. They weren't there for it.
Right.
Were they?
So that's the second part of the statement, right?
Yeah.
The Bible is a reliable collection of historical documents written by eyewitnesses during the lifetime of other eyewitnesses. And this is a huge point, that the Bible was written by eyewitnesses during the lifetime of other eyewitnesses. Now, 1 Corinthians 15 attests to this. He has the phrase, most of whom are still alive. In fact, at the very least, 301 eyewitnesses to the resurrection were around when 1 Corinthians was written. So Paul had at least 300 other people to fact check him, to say, like, nope, what you're writing there is a lie, yet not a single one does. It's entirely falsifiable. If they were to say, like, nope, that didn't happen, but you don't see that in any other writing. Mm-hmm. So I think that that's an incredibly important point, that the Bible is, we demonstrated that you can trust the historicity of it, but also internally, those authors are actually the eyewitnesses of the events that they're describing. So it's not hearsay, it's not third-party information.
Yeah, and I think we can compare that to a point we made earlier when we're talking about the other manuscripts written about the Iliad or about Aristotle's teachings. Those people aren't even close to eyewitnesses.
Nope.
We're talking about people that are just writing down the stories they've been told.
Exactly.
Right? We're talking about people who are saying like, this is what happened. I was there.
I was there.
I was there. Okay. I think in a service a while back, maybe not a while back, it was on Easter. It would have been on Easter about Pastor Edward told a story about him meeting the Queen in the mall. Obviously, this is a fictitious story. This isn't true. But if he came up to you and said, hey, I met the Queen in the mall at Markville Mall. It's crazy, like just the craziest thing. You wouldn't believe him, naturally, because it makes no sense. But if 15 other friends who didn't know each other that you knew all came up and said the same thing, you might start to believe it. Maybe you might realize, hey, what do all 15 of these people gain from lying to me? Probably nothing. They don't even know each other.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the truth, right? And they become reliable. These stories, we have 500 people at the resurrection. We have thousands of people who experience other events that we're talking about. Like, if the story was false, someone would speak out. Someone would be like, hey, I was an eyewitness, and that's not true. It doesn't happen.
Not only did they not speak out, they died for it too. Like, they had nothing to gain, and then they went to their grave. Some of them, like, if they were to recant some of the stories that they were telling,
they would have been fine.
They would have been fine. They would not have died. Yet they died for this truth. So you know that it's reliable.
I doubt the Pharisees ever said, just recant and you can get out. Yeah, I don't want to spend too much time on that because I want to encourage people to read it and then challenge, right? Like if you're reading through the Bible, we just want to give you a little bit of help to know like where you can trust it and where not. Let's get to the last kind of three. And we're kind of leaving the realm of, hey, we can prove this through data and we see it through manuscripts. And we're going to get into three ideas of supernatural, prophecies, and divine. Those are the three ideas we're going to hit on.
One more point though.
Okay.
One quick point. So we talked about external reliability as well.
Yeah.
The Bible is extremely externally reliable as well because there have been over 25,000 archaeological digs with relation to the Bible or things that the Bible has talked about that have not a single one contradicted what the Bible says. Not a single one. So 25,000 times people have either tried to prove or disprove something in the Bible, and nothing has disproven the Bible.
Okay, good point to sneak in there before I moved on. Very good point to sneak in before I moved on. The end of the statement we get to, I'll just reread the whole thing, but we get to the Bible's reliable collection of historical documents written by eyewitnesses during the life of eyewitnesses who report supernatural events that fulfill specific prophecies and claim that the writings are divine rather than human origin. We're going to focus on the supernatural, the prophecies, and them being divine. Kick it off with supernatural.
Okay, so the Bible isn't just recording something that is like, Rick went to the store, then he got a fish, then he came home, then he cooked a fish, and that was it. No, this is something that was wild.
You should be a writer, man.
This was like Jesus feeding the 5,000. Like this was Jesus dying, like actually dying. Then they bury this guy and he comes back from the grave. This is people who have never walked in their life or have been lepers, and there's no cure for this, and they're coming back from this. Mm-hmm. People who are blind. We don't even have cures for that today for most of the diseases that make you blind. We don't have fixes for that. Yet Jesus is here curing blindness. These are supernatural events, and specifically that fulfill prophecy that is mentioned in the Old Testament. So I said that we'd talk about this at a future time. This is the future time. I prophesied this. Yeah. I just want to say.
I prophesied this.
But Isaiah 53 was written 700 years before Jesus comes, and it accurately predicted how Jesus would come and how he would die. If that's not old enough for you, Psalm 22 and all over the Bible, Psalm 22, over 1,000 years before the crucifixion, written by a man who never saw a crucifixion, yet he describes the crucifixion. Genesis 2, where God says that he shall crush your head, you shall bruise his heel, was written thousands and thousands of years before Jesus comes, yet here he is to fulfill the specific prophecy and fulfill it in a supernatural way. So it isn't just any humdrum, boring book. It's a book that recounts something that is like otherworldly, supernatural, if you will.
Yeah, I think what this relates back to, if we want to make a connection, it relates back to the internal reliability, and that's why Lester kind of got caught making that point before we wanted to, was this isn't just a book that says like, hey, in the future, good things are going to happen, which could define anything. It makes specific claims about what's going to happen, like specific claims about what's going to happen in the future. And then we see those events happen in history and then reports on it. Yeah. Right? Like it's not just like, oh, one day some humans are going to rule the world. Well, that yeah, sure. There's humans who run the world all the place. It's like, hey, this guy is going to come and die. Like, how could you ever call that? Not only it predicts his birth, like there's prophecies that Jesus fulfills in the Bible that were about his birth that he had no control out. And how would they ever know the circumstances of that? That'd be like me saying, my grandchild. No, it's not even like that. It's like my great grandchild will be born in a hotel on the 39th floor in the second room. Like, that's not going to happen, right? If that does, I want credit, though.
Watch this.
But you know what I mean? Like, it relates to that internal reliability because it makes outlandish claims and then backs them up. We see them happen in history. Let's push on to the end and get to the divinity of it.
Yes.
Because this is honestly probably the more important part. Like, we can show how historically, there's reliability and we can go through the manuscripts and everything. But we don't read the Bible just because it's a historical document.
Absolutely not.
Right? Like, that's not what the Bible is to Christians. It's a lot more than a historical document. And what makes it not just a historical document is?
It's divine rather than human in origin. Exactly that. That we believe that the Word of God is from God, that it is inspired by God. And that's what makes it true. Ultimately, all of that other statement aside, this is the thing that makes it true. Because our God is true and he speaks the truth. This is what makes the Bible so relevant. It's the point that makes everything else kind of fade into the background, that God delivered this word to us. And so for a fact that it's reliable.
Yeah. I mean, that's going to come to a belief, though.
Of course.
And if you're listening to this, you're like, well, I don't believe in the divinity of Christ. If you don't even believe in God, it's going to be pretty hard to believe that he did this. You might have to get around that first. But for us who are following, it's almost comforting. It should be a little bit comforting. Like, hey, this wasn't just a book that like humans made to like try to explain things, or we just like, we're in the 15th century and we're like, oh, we need something to talk about and let's write a book. Like, I mean, I know it was written a long time before that, but I'm just using an example. This is a book is inspired by God. And when we go to it, we can learn about him himself.
Yeah.
Like, it's not just like, oh, I learned about history, great on. Like, you can do that in any book, right? We can learn about who Jesus is. We can see his character. We can grow closer to him. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to find a passionate Christian who does their devotions every day who doesn't learn more about God every day. Like, that's, you know what I mean? And I'm not saying like, I'm not trying to do your devotions every day case. Yeah. I'm saying people who are just pursuing God will often be like, oh, read the Bible. Why do they say that? Because you can see him in the Bible. And that's where we get the divinity of Christ through there.
Absolutely. The thing about the Bible is that it's the primary source for God's revelation of himself. The number one way he reveals himself to us is through his word. And honestly, what better way? I mean, what?
Yeah, I actually had a very interesting conversation a couple nights ago, and someone was saying they were talking about how God, we see God show up to people throughout the Bible. And a guy was telling a story about how God showed up to him in prisons in England, like modern day, like he's alive today. And a couple of guys were saying just like, I've never experienced something like that. I've never done it. And I was struck with the question of, well, that might be great for them, but that might not work for you. So why would God ever appear to you like that? And I think sometimes as Christians, we're like, why isn't God showing up on my front door and being like, hey, I'm God and follow me? Well, he knows you better than you know yourself.
Yeah.
Right? And for a lot of us, we want some proof. We want other people to give us a little bit of like, hey, yeah, this is, we want like, I support in that. I don't know if that's the best way to put it, but like, and what a better way than to write about it so anyone can read it. Yes, it's a good tool, but I just think some people don't realize that the Bible is God revealing himself to us. We kind of think of it as just like a book we carry around, when it's the primary way, as you said, that he reveals himself to us. And it should be the primary thing we go to whenever we want to pursue or like see more of him. So if you're wondering why you haven't experienced God, maybe you can go to the Bible and you'll see that's where we experience him the most. And that's not always this crazy, oh, he appeared to me in lightning and then the land glue and I knew where I was supposed to go. No, he shows you through the Bible. That's where we experience God. And that can be tough to swallow sometimes because, it'd be awesome to have some of those moments. Yeah. Well, they sound awesome. I don't think we see the downside of them. But yeah, that's the point I want to make is if you want to experience God, go to the Bible. Yeah. He'll show himself to you. And every single person I know is always more joyful, more in tune with God, like more passionate about pursuing him when they're pursuing him and reading their Bible. Yeah,
we're not all going to have this burning bush moment or Elijah on the mountain or like,
or Jacob wrestling him for all night, like something like that.
There's a reason those stories are in the Bible. They were special, really, really special. I'm not David. You aren't either. So,
Wow. Yes, that's true. All right. We want to make 2 more points before we, hang up the old shirt and I was going to go somewhere I shouldn't have gone with that. All right. So why don't you jump into the last point, Lester? You want to make, we don't want to prove the Bible with other things. We don't want to use that statement.
Yeah. So the thing about apologetics oftentimes is that we want to use other things and prove the Bible. We want to prove it by like looking at this document or that document. And the thing is, we cannot surrender the Bible as the ultimate and highest authority. If you're going to give credit to these other documents as, look, this thing proves the Bible, you're actually diminishing the Bible by saying this thing is more true than the Bible is. You're comparing the Bible to, whereas the Bible actually is the truest thing. And all other things should be compared to it because it is the Word of God.
I see. So we don't want to replace the authority of the Bible with something else. We don't want to be like, well, we can prove the Bible exists because of this document. Then you're giving more authority to the second document.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. That's a good point. And lastly, but not least.
So we want to just wrap it all up by saying the thing about the Bible is that, yes, we know that it's reliable. We know it's historical, all these things. But what does that mean for me? Mm-hmm. And the most important thing to remember when you're reading your Bible is that it is true. It has always been true, and it is always relevant to your life because its truths are eternal. They are forever. And so the God of the universe is directly communicating to you through his word. For all time. So I think that is something that we need to keep in mind when we're reading the Bible. It's not a textbook. It's not some book of history. It is actually God revealing himself to you. And it's always going to be relevant for you.
Yeah. It's relevant for your day to day. Don't think of it like a textbook. We just wanted to show that if you're ever asked why you believe in the Bible, maybe this will help show you that there's reliability. There's a standpoint you can stand on from like why do you believe in it? And then you can go into the divine part, which is, I'm going to say the most important part, where we see God. And that's as simple as we can put it, at risk of repeating ourselves for another time. The Bible's important to us because it affects our day-to-day life. Yes. And that's the truth, right? That's why I really believe it. I'm going to end it there.
And if you try it, it'll work.
If you try it, it'll work. But don't have that as your own reason, only reason. I'm going to end it there. I hope that this is helpful. It's something I just think we don't think about a lot. It's just something like on the side, and we just trust. And there's nothing wrong with just trusting it, but maybe a little food for your thought, Mm-hmm. Guys, thanks for joining us. As always, you can reach out to the testing123 at springvale.org. If you have any questions or comments or concerns, we'd love to hear from you. And we hope you guys enjoy this one.